this much left. So that I'm clean shaven.
Okay. Welcome back. How are your nervous systems? Yeah.
I have just a follow-up question to that. So when we start practicing with clients, or sitting with clients, I should say, and then we notice these things that are happening in our nervous system,
Yeah.
sort of attachment stuff,
Right.
things that they're explaining to us. What in your experiences, how do you, I mean, I know that obviously working with your own, doing your own personal therapy on the side,
Sure.
but like, what do you
Mm-hmm.
recommend, or what do you?
How do you
find in your
how do you use that, or what do you do with it?
yeah, so do you use it, do you kind of try to, being aware of it, I'm sure is
Mhm.
important, but.
Yeah, I think we're going to try and get to that in a way that hopefully is like clear. You know, in terms of like what do you do concretely in the moment? You know, you either use it as data, as you're trying to form a hypothesis about what's going on, and so you keep it to yourself, but you notice it, or you try to find timing to self-disclose it. But how you self-disclose it is pretty important, and when you do it is extremely important. And we're going to talk about how to think about that as a clinician. That's sort of my goal here for the next hour or so. But good question. Yeah. So, any other questions before we kind of move on to clinical practice? Anything in the theory that you want to clarify? Yeah.
So I was thinking about if a parent ends up like, let's say they abandon their child or something, and the grandparent takes them on. It happens a lot, even in the Hispanic culture.
Yes.
And so, is the child, if the parent or if the grandparent is like secure attachment, but like, are they automatically damaged because their parents aren't there?
Right. They automatically have something to overcome. But it's a little simple to say it this way, but I think it's generally true. If you have a good enough attachment figure somewhere, then you have, as a primary figure, maybe even as a secondary figure as you get up into later childhood and adolescence. If you have somebody that can do this, even if they're not the primary parent, but they're very close, like a grandparent, you have the ability, the nervous system can have the ability then to imprint on two different things. So you can have an experience of secure responsiveness, which a kid will probably gravitate towards. Or you can have the need for the insecure strategy with the parent. But those things are, the younger the kid, probably the more flexible that might be. That makes sense? Yeah.
So I've been talking about how like the insecure attachment is actually like a healthy like strategy to like survive in that kind of environment.
That's right.
But with that, are we also saying that like that environment is not the most optimal? Like the secure environment is most optimal. Like is that still the distinction?
Yeah.
Like
So I
one
think
is kind of a better situation than the other.
Yeah, I get it. It's hard because I'm asking you to think about it not in terms of like what's better, but what's functional. But if we're talking about optimal, look at number 4. I'm getting back to that calm status quo. I can move about the world doing my developmental tasks without distraction. Ideally, you do that with a secure base. Does that make sense? Yeah. But you got, I mean, look, if you're in a war zone, your healthy, secure strategies are worthless. In fact, they're dangerous. Right? So, you know, you don't get to be a corporate CEO usually by having a lot of secure attachments. that make sense to anybody? You want to win? You're thinking about self-preservation. You're inhibiting negative affect. You're pushing through your nervous system. You're fighting against it. No, I want you to understand, it's not, clinically, it's not that helpful to think in terms of what's optimal. And we're going to talk about that right now. It's much more useful to think in terms of what's adaptive. Okay. Yeah.
So then with that, is the goal in therapy then to talk with an adult client as far as what's been adaptive and what is adaptive rather than
I like that. Are you saying, what's the goal of therapy with an adult?
within an attachment?
Yeah. Again, the idea of what we're shooting for with people, if we use just attachment theory, is flexibility of strategy and adaptiveness to situation and environment. So if you grew up in a pretty abusive household and you've developed the ability to inhibit negative affect, and therefore you're rather disconnected from your emotions and your nervous system, you're going to have a hard time in intimate relationships because that's all emotional communication. And if you marry somebody or you partner with somebody that grew up in a pretty predictable, stable, responsive place, your strategies probably aren't going to flex. You're probably not going to be able to adapt very quickly or very easily to being with somebody who's there for you. Does that make sense? And how is that person going to interpret your inability to receive from them, to go to them when you need them, your compulsive self-reliance or your compulsive caretaking of them? They're going to feel disconnected, they're going to feel distance, and they're likely to filter that through their experience, which is going to say, this is unsafe, this is insecure, this person's not here with me. We're going to have trouble. Okay, that brings us to therapy and how we deal with relationship issues, which is really what attachment is all about, is using human relationships to soothe. Let me say that again. Attachment is all about using human relationships to soothe. Attachment is an evolutionary theory. It is based in Darwin. It is about survival. It's unapologetic about that. So the use of other people to soothe the nervous system is really what we're talking about. Your ability to do that is really your ability to thrive, theoretically. Anybody struggling with that, or does that make sense? Okay. So when you're a therapist, okay, quick quiz. How many people, if you have to put one of these with being a parent and one of these with being a therapist, how many people think this one would be the therapist? Oh, you're so good. Yeah, you're right. This one's the therapist. This one's a parent. Being a parent is about trying to provide as best you can. Safety, shelter, food, and in this case, emotional responsiveness, and presence, and reliability, predictability. You're not, as a parent, Matt's not walking in saying, what does it feel like to have a dirty diaper right now? I'm curious about that. I'd like to, yeah, that's right. I too have had a dirty diaper. No, you perform your function in your child's life. Okay. So when we think about how do you, as a therapist, work from an attachment standpoint with your clients, we're talking about developing a spirit of curiosity. Okay? And that posture, in fact, I'd like you to write that down, a posture of curiosity, is what we're shooting for most of the time. Now, I wrote something on the board that I think I mentioned last time. Optimal gratification versus optimal frustration. There's some debates about which is curative, which is healing. So we were having a conversation about conditioning, about these attuned, timely responses, and how the baby learns that the world is going to be there or not there, right? So what is it? Is it like 70% of the time? Is it 85% of the time? I don't know. There's probably research on that, I don't know. But what we're generally talking about is not being totally perfect, okay? Because, frankly, the world is never going to be totally responsive, emotionally engaged, and present for this person, correct? Right? Obviously. Some of us, you may know people that were raised in homes that were really a little too gratifying. And there's research on kids that are gratified, or we call it spoiled, a little too much, that don't have enough frustration, and they struggle. According to attachment theory, why would they struggle? Anybody know?
Well, because their parents might gratify all their needs, but in the real world, not everyone's gonna
Right, so how are their strategies? Are they well developed? Are they flexible? Are they able to adapt? No, probably not, right? Okay, so actually it's pretty important that it's not perfect. All right, there needs to be some time between the cry and the response. There needs to be the ability for the kid to develop some stamina and the ability to tolerate frustration. And eventually the ability to self-soothe in a healthy way. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So when we think about being a therapist with somebody, we're not thinking about trying to provide optimal responses. See number 3 over here? The timely, attuned, emotionally engaged response. Yes, as therapists we would like to do that, right? But what does that look like? What would that look like? That's to your question a little bit. Like you're sitting with a client, let's say it's an avoidant male, okay, who's struggling with depression and doesn't have a lot of access to their feelings, and they're telling you a story. And you notice that, boy, they can tell the details of the story. It's very sequential, it's in order, they've got everything kind of together. But there's a conspicuous absence of emotion in the story. So I was at, Melanie's the other day, and we had a fight, and it really sucked. She said she didn't want to see me again, and I don't know. I don't know. How do you sit with that? What do you do? What do you say? Any ideas? What's your instinct?
I would probably explore it a little more, ask open questions specifically about Melanie, the relationship, how he usually reacts to being in a fight with her. Has it happened before?
Good, you get more details, you'd start to try to build a picture of the relationship and his experience in the relationship. Good instinct. Yeah.
Try and see if he is a little bit in check with his emotions.
Excellent.
How are you feeling?
That's good, right. So let's say you ask him that is, as an attachment therapist, you're looking to, let's put it in really basic terms. Right now, his strategy in the world, he walks through the world inhibiting negative affect, but being really dominated by it, but doesn't know what to do with it. And whatever the strategies were that were keeping it at bay are breaking down, and he's becoming depressed. Helplessness, sadness, it's all coming up, and he's flooded by it. But he can't describe it, can't tell anyone about it, can't symbolize it, can't even recognize that he's feeling it, though he knows something's wrong, right? So what's our goal? We have to start back at number 1. You can't just pick up at number 3. right? This is what I'd really like you to get as future therapists. If you're stuck sitting in the chair thinking about what is a timely attuned response to this person right now, you kind of lost. Okay, if you're thinking about yourself and what you should be doing, which you will all do for several years, it's very difficult to work with people. And it is very difficult when you first get out to do this, because you don't know how to do it, and you're thinking about manuals and treatments, and you're not sitting in the moment with your client, even though you know you should, which sucks. But you'll be okay. You have to do it a few thousand times, and then you start to relax, and you can begin to focus on 1 and 2, unselfconsciously. Now you can do that self-consciously and still be effective. So feel it in the body. So I'm gonna ask you guys to go to number 1 with this guy. So if you want to go to his body and to his emotions, give me some ideas. How might you proceed? Yeah.
Like as you were telling me this,
Good.
where do you feel, like, do you feel anything in your body?
Great.
Like any tension, any
Yeah.
areas where you feel like
God,
weight?
I should have brought candy. That was excellent. Very good. Yeah, I will do that. I will do that. I will thank you. I will directly, if I have a sense of rapport, and there's a sense of safety in the room, and it feels like this guy could handle me coming towards him a little bit and pushing him a little bit, I would ask directly. So, let me back that up. When Melanie broke up with you, is what it sounds like. What happened to you? What was that like? It sucked. I bet it sucked. As I sit with you right now, I have this sensation in my chest of crushing, it hurts, like heartbreak. Did you feel heartbreak? Yeah. Of course I did. Who wouldn't? That's what I'm saying. I think everybody would. I do, because I hear you talk about it. Where do you feel it in your body? I felt it in my chest. Where did you feel it? To answer your question, that's one way to deal with emotions. But I wouldn't say that if you didn't feel it, by the way. I wouldn't lie about it. Because if you're not really feeling it in your chest, he's probably not either. Right? If he's telling you that story and you have no emotional response whatsoever, you're in a different boat. You got a different kind of client there where there's nothing going on in number 1 at all. And you're in for a different ride. Please don't ask me what to do with that. I don't know. It sucks. It's hard dealing with narcissistic, cut-off men or women. People that have no access to number 1 can be really difficult and boring to work with. And that is the hardest client to work with, is where there's nothing in the room and you're so bored. What is boredom? Boredom's an emotion, yeah. What is boredom?
Anxiety state?
Could be. Could be anxiety.
Lack of stimulus.
It is a profound lack of stimulation. And how does a nervous system achieve a profound lack of stimulation? It disconnects and dissociates. So if you're bored in a session, what might that mean about your client? If your nervous system is bored and understimulated, remember, this is an attachment style relationship, right? You are sitting in a room with somebody very close to them, and they're there to open up to you and get help, just like they would reach to a parent. And you are pretty attuned and pretty emotionally engaged, and when a parent has their child reach like this, remember what happens in the nervous system of the parent. If your nervous system feels nothing, in fact it's uncomfortable and understimulated, what does that probably mean about your client? Anybody? They're probably dissociative. They're probably very disconnected, and they're using a profound inhibitory strategy with their emotions.
Is that what might have, is that,
It's one way to think about it.
okay.
You could just be terrible. You could just be having an off day, you know, thinking about, you have other tabs open in your mind, you know. That happens a lot. But it usually is, there's an absence of stimulation in the room, and usually that means an absence of stimulation in the person.
What if they're terribly depressed, they're just terribly depressed, and they have no energy,
Yeah,
and it's heavy to work with a depressed client.
It
and
is.
It can feel boring as well, because it's like, oh.
you know, my experience with depression, and full disclosure, I choose to be open about this. I have struggled with pretty severe clinical depression. I choose to be open about it because I want to fight the stigma of mental illness. So I've spent a lot of time getting treatment. And I've been afraid of boring my clinicians many times. Because in an experience of depression, it isn't, for me, an absence of emotion, but it's an abundance of a certain kind of emotion and a kind of shutdown that is profound. It can be dissociative, and I think therapists can feel dissociative with depressed clients. But more often with depressed clients, it is heavy, and that's a little different. It's weighted, it's helpless, it's anguishing, and it can be exhausting. More often than not, with a depressed client, you'll feel tired, not bored. Yeah. And that's okay. And if you have a good relationship, you can say that. You know, that you can feel the fatigue, you can feel the exhaustion, you can feel the lack of energy. But you're going to stay with that person, and you're going to try and be curious about what it's like to be them. And you're going to do what I want to say is something extremely important. You're going to help them organize what's happening to them. Okay? So, in a spirit of curiosity, which is largely a guide about how you posture and how you talk, okay? I'm wondering what it's like right now. I'm wondering what it's like in your body. Can you help me understand? That's the posturing of the therapist. But that what you're actually doing is you're beginning to pull up, number one, and you're beginning to help give words, number two, and symbolize what's happening internally to them so that they can begin to do number one and number two with you. And then number three kind of happens naturally. Because most of us, it comes kind of naturally. If somebody is saying, I'm hurting and I need this, everything in you is going to pretty much want to gratify it, and that's largely okay. Unless they want to sit on your lap, and then you got to say no. It happens. It happens. Well, as a therapist joke, but there are times where there's erotic transference, or things are sexualized, or in a really archaic way, they just want to be touched and held. Because you get down to some of the basic stuff, if you're an infant and you're not being responded to, do you really want words? Is an infant really craving somebody to reflect to them? No. What is the primary thing, the primary channel that an infant experiences is reassuring? Yeah, so your clients are likely to long for touch. So, you know, I made a joke about sitting in your lap, but that could be in the room. So what do you do with that? I'm telling you not to gratify it. I mean, probably a bad idea in a lot of levels. Not the least of which is you probably can't do that every session, and they will want to. So what do you do with it?
Just an aside, so I worked with kids a lot at my church, and it was interesting, over the course of several years, it went from, let kids sit in your lap and let them stay there, to don't let them sit in your lap, because then they'll always sit in your lap and they won't engage with others.
Yeah,
What do you
I
think?
I don't work directly with kids under probably 8 or 9, and it's been a long time since I have, so I'm not gonna make an attempt at that, but that sounds to me more like a liability issue. But,
They meant it in the sense of the child won't socialize with other children, they'll only go to you. That's what they meant, in that
are
context.
these kids,
4 or 5.
are they abused, are they,
No, just, well, I'm wondering back if that would be why, if they're looking to make a sincere connection with someone.
yeah, I would tend to disagree. I mean, I don't know the situation, but I would tend to disagree. You say something like, that totally makes sense to me, that you need touch. And I can feel a sense of deprivation. And ideally, you'd say something like, I would love to be able to give that to you, if that's true, that you would love that. But I'm afraid that I couldn't really follow through ultimately on providing that for you in a way that was sustainable. And that could do more damage if I make that promise. So I'm gonna hold a boundary for myself and for you and try and stay with you the way I can. How'd that sound? That sound okay? Yeah. And then try to return to curiosity about what that is like for them to hear in that moment. Do they feel pushed away? Do they feel rejected? Do they feel that sense of abandonment? Can you stay with them in that as they feel it? Can they feel it and express it to you? Because that would be a huge win. Right? I'm really pissed at you right now. I want to throw a tantrum. Whew, that would be gold if you could get them to say that. Does that make sense? Okay. So, yeah.
I think going back to like the feeling in the body, how do you transition from that to number 2?
Right. Well, so that's the right question. Thank you. Therapist as a borrowed self, right? So the client's borrowing the organizing abilities of the therapist. The therapist is largely helping with number 2, right? We are trying to give structure, language, symbols, anything to help them get this to this, ultimately to this. Remember, the goal in an attachment theory is to get them to be able to use relationships for soothing in a way that's safe and flexible and adaptive, right? So they're working on this with you. You're the laboratory with that, if it's individual therapy. Okay. Oh, God. I'm going to try this. This may be a little bit too heady, but please write down a name. And if you are ever really interested in going deep on attachment theory, this is Mary Ainsworth's heir and disciple, and she has developed attachment theory into something that is spectacular. Her name is Patricia Crittenden, Crittenden. I've seen her many times, and she developed the dynamic maturational model of attachment, completely non-pathologizing, does away with the secure-insecure altogether, and talks about it really in terms of 2 different processing systems in the brain and in the body. She says there are only really 2 kinds of input, sensory input. There is sequential input, when this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And there is intensity. When it happened this intensely, or when it happened this intensely. It was this loud, or it was this loud. Okay? Kind of did the cross thing again. So, if you grow up in a home that's fairly predictable and da-da-da-da-da, and what we'd call secure, you're able to process things sequentially. You know, when mom does this, this happens next, and then I feel and you're able to process intensity. Whoa, mom's getting upset, I know what that means. Okay, I respond to that, I know that intensity and that emotion means something, and when that happens, this happens, so okay. But if an environment like an alcoholic family system is not very sequential or predictable, you learn to read the intensity of affect in the room. Does that make sense? Okay, so you overvalue affect as you make determinations about your environment. You overvalue intensity. And you undervalue what? Sequence. Right, right. So you read a room based on how the feeling is. You read a room based on whether somebody's upset. You're okay if somebody's calm, but you're not okay if they're upset. And you're not paying a whole lot of attention to what came before or after. That can be an issue. Conversely, you're in a house that's pretty rigid, everything's pretty ordered and predictable, but there isn't a whole lot of range of emotion at all. So you don't really know how to read it when somebody's upset. You don't really know how to read intensity, but you can put everything in order. I know this doesn't translate right away to pathology and how to think about it, and it's a little bit tricky, but she ends up looking at this in a way that is really helpful, and if you want to dig deeper, please look her up. It's worth some time. Where the heck was I going with that? Most of the time, you are, as a therapist, are going to be helping to organize the sequence that something happened in and the intensity of emotion that goes with it. Most of your interventions or your responses are going to involve those two things. So when Melanie said A, it made you feel B. And feeling B was really intense. Basic reflections, extremely important for organizing and representing inner states. Sequential and intense. Yeah? Questions about that? Okay, let's move from individual work to couples work real quick. Anybody interested in working with couples? Ha! Oh, one brave soul. Good, good. I'll hire you. We, as Rich was saying, help my marriage, help my relationships is increasingly the number one thing that comes in the door. Not surprising, we're increasingly isolated as a culture, we're spread thin, we're disconnected. People are walking around not really knowing how to do this with their partners, and it's causing lots of problems, and they seek treatment for it. Make sense? Okay. I really encourage you all to think about, if you're going to explore attachment, think about working with couples, because it is so much quicker and more efficient to work with somebody's primary attachment object in the room than to have to do it with you. Because doing individual work is cumbersome and timely, and it can take forever for them to get a safe bond with you if they've been really damaged. Or you get the person they're going through life with and they're already dependent on, and their attachment system is turned on and going, and you can see it live and you can work with it right there. Does that make sense? EFT, Emotion Focused Couples Therapy. Heard of it? Yes? You just had that lecture?
Yeah.
Perfect. EFT is my favorite model for really working with any two people in a family. It's excellent for family therapy, but it is normed on couples. Really, you just need a dyad that's attached to each other. Why is that? Well, you're dealing with the same thing. It's not very complicated. Anybody want to do a role play? Any brave exhibitionistic souls? Didn't think so. Okay, fine. What's your name? Allison? Okay. Let's say that we're married and we go into therapy. Okay? Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're having trouble communicating. We get into these fights, and when we fight, you come at me with a list of things that you've been holding on to that I haven't done. I feel blindsided. And initially I get defensive, but you tend to up the ante when I get defensive. And after 1 or 2 rounds of that, I shut down and just disappear. I disconnect. Did you guys go over this morning? Yeah, it's a classic dance, right? Okay, so let's play high-low with this a little bit. When I disappear, what is that like for you, do you think?
Well, you just like literally described my life at home with my parents.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, most of us can probably relate to this. Because it is a basic attachment pattern, okay? And generally, it tends to be a female partner, but it could go either way with gender. If you feel like you can't find your partner, it is pretty much identical to the parent walking out the door. Your system should
Yeah, I'm
feel
supposed to freak out.
confused and panicked and freaked out, right? But how do most of us represent that? So the little kid doesn't go to the door saying, I'm confused and freaked out.
They yell and scream, throw things, be violent.
Mm-hmm. We see a lot of anger. We see secondary emotion. Anger is like smoke. What's beneath anger is the fire of fear. And a lot of people would say there are 2 emotions. Really, when you break it down, there is afraid and not afraid. So you get afraid when I shut down and emotionally I'm not available for you and I'm not responding to you anymore. And what do? Do you shut down too?
Panic.
You panic, so you probably come towards me to answer me. And you probably up the ante on me a little bit. Right? Not only did you not do these 10 things, you jerk, but now you're just going to walk away? Pathetic. Now, what is it like to be a man who's being told he's done 10 things wrong and currently he's being pathetic? Oh yeah, it sucks. Yeah, it sucks.
Demeaning.
It's demeaning. Big capital S. Shame. Yeah, shame. Okay. Tons of shame. All right? Shame makes you want to hide and shut down. Why is he ashamed? Well, kind of matters how she looks at him. Kind of matters that the one person he's going through life with thinks he's a piece of dirt. Does he think she's going to stay with him if he's pathetic? Probably not. Does he think that she's going to be there for him and be responsive to his needs when she's looking at him like he's a piece of dirt? Okay, so what's his nervous system doing?
Shut down.
It's freaking out, and he's shutting down because generally he doesn't want to make it worse, and he doesn't know what else to do. But he is doing the worst thing he could possibly do to her attachment system, right? We call this high-low. It goes in a figure 8, right? You probably did that this morning. You didn't do this morning? What kind of EFT presentation was this? This is basic EFT.
I'll give you a name.
What's that?
I'll give you a name.
You would give me a name? Oh, yeah. That's all right. I can't handle working here anyway.
Sue Johnson.
Sue Johnson is one of my heroes. Sue Johnson developed this model from Les Greenberg, who did it with individuals, but she took it to couples, and she watched thousands of hours of tape of couples and couples therapy, and she came up with an exquisite model of how to work with attachment feelings in a room and how to break this terrible cycle that really is throwing gas on each partner's attachment system and just continually making it worse until they do this, right? And they do this not to spite each other. They do this because the hotter the intensity gets between them, the scarier it gets. And they are trying to save the marriage by disconnecting and not making it worse. And eventually, the woman in this situation will give up tantruming because it is so damn painful and scary to keep knocking on that door and not having him come back. Disconnect from the nervous system, pull away from the painful trigger, which is my partner now, and we have avoidance. Avoidance of the partner? No, avoidance of intolerable negative affect. When you cannot get emotional engagement, responsiveness, availability from your partner, it is so painful that you begin to avoid it. And this is the death of the marriage, slowly over time. Okay? How do you work with that couple? That's what EFT is about. If I were the therapist, I would start with you, and I would say, you know what, let's slow this down a little bit. And I would show you the triggers. You know, sequential, ready? When you see in his face, because attachment is emotional language, not verbal language, when you see that look in his face, and he's going blank, and you know he's getting ready to disconnect, I want you to press pause there and slow that down. What is that like for you? I hate it. It's terrible. I'm so angry. I could explode. Okay. Now you gotta be a little careful there, right? Because he's sitting right there, full of shame and full of fear, and she's saying, I could kill him. Okay. Now you say, okay, that makes sense to me. Can I have you stay with that, though? Number one. Can you go down, take the elevator down into your body a little bit? I want you to think again. You see his face begin to turn away from attachment prompt. You begin to lose him. Where do you feel that? I feel it in my gut. What's that like when you lose him? Again, attachment cue. What is it like when you lose him? And you'll watch them go inside. It hurts. Right. Right. It's painful, isn't it? Right. I hear you. I bet it hurts when he turns away. But what ends up happening when you hurt like that? How does that come out? Number two, how do you symbolize that to your partner? What does that look like? Do you tell him that you're hurting? Oh, no. No. No, I go after him. I know I come after him, and I know it doesn't work, but I can't help it. I get it. I get it. Right. You're hurting so much that you have to try and get him to engage with you. Right? Yeah, exactly. Right. Turn to the guy. But when she does that, do you feel like she's trying to reach out for you and get you to come towards her? What, are you joking? No. She's looking at me like I'm a piece of shit. Right, I get that. Right. I see that. I could totally see that. What do you think when she says that she's actually hurting inside? Is that new information for you? Yeah, I have no idea. I thought she was just disappointed and frustrated. Right. When she gets that look on her face that she's disappointed and angry with you, can you slow that down for a minute and imagine that she and I have no idea what it's like to be in your shoes? What does that feel like to you? Now, if you have a really in-tune guy, he'll be able to drop down. If you have a regular guy, you're gonna be there. You're gonna be there a while because culturally here, we do not encourage men to do this. Women are encouraged to do this, more so than men. That does not mean that they have a particular advantage, but it does mean culturally that it's a little bit easier, and they're a little more practiced, generally. So you gotta hang out with them for a while. And it's not that complicated, but it's hard to do, because it's uncomfortable. It's hard to move in towards a guy who wants to, my name's in here. You're close. Who wants to move towards an inexpressive guy and be like, no, I know that. Right? You feel yourself moving back? Right. And it feels uncomfortable to me to move towards him. Why does it feel uncomfortable?
Self-preservation.
Good. Good. Who Whose self-preservation? Mine or his? His. But if I'm a dude, which I am, and I grew up in the States, which I did, in a middle-class family, which I did, I'm highly likely to have a pretty avoidant system when it comes to intimacy with other men. And so my system's probably moving back too. All right? Okay. So we don't tend to press guys. We tend to want to move away from their affect. All right? But we need to actually move towards it, and we need to stay with them. We don't want to invade your space and trigger you, but we don't want to move too far away either. And so we try to stay right where we're at. And if all you can say is, it sucks, then you say it sucks. Say it's hard, it's difficult. You don't use feeling language until you start to feel like he can get there a little bit. Now, if he's really not getting there and you want to cheat, you could milk it. You could start feeding him some feeling language. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. A lot of times, if you can't do number one, you can't do number two. So how do you get somebody to get down in touch with their emotions if they're blocking from the session?
But if you start feeding them like emotion words and things like that for the guys, is that guiding?
It's guiding, and if they can actually feel it, it's okay. You know, if they're actually feeling it in their body, and you say, you know what, it looks like you're scared. And they're like, yeah, that's right, I couldn't find the word, but yep, that's what it is. Great, no harm, no foul. If they're not able to feel it or recognize it at all, and you say you're scared, what are they gonna say?
What are you talking about?
What are you talking about? No, I'm not scared. Which, by the way, is great, because you're like, oh, okay, there we are. Yeah, you're not. Right, you're not scared. So what is that like for you? Help me get that, because I'm trying to understand. Because when she does that, you really shut down and disappear. Yeah? Oh yeah, I do. I just don't want to do this anymore. It's just there's no point to it. What's the point? It's never gonna work. It's just sucks. Yeah, I hear you. It sucks so bad, you just want to get out of there so it doesn't get worse. Right. Ooh. Actually feels, I don't know, hopeless? That would be kind of feeding.
But as a counselor, you probably don't want to go to that end, but what if the guy really just want to be out? Like, he's going to be out of that relationship. Is that possible?
Oh, well, okay, there's certain contraindications for EFT. That would be one of them. The EFT is not going to work with somebody who doesn't want to be in the relationship. Because their attachment system is off. Yeah. So yeah, EFT is about activating the attachment system in the room, helping them do number one and number two, and eventually you're getting primary affect in sequence, and you get them to say it to each other, which is number two. So if EFT is going well, Allison would say to her husband, when I see you disappear, it makes me feel terrified and panicky and alone, like I'm never going to get you, and that you really don't want to be with me. It makes me feel like I'm worthless. And if he's bonded with her, which 9 times out of 10 people seeking couples therapy are, what's he going to do when he hears that the person he loves is feeling that way? He's going to move towards her. He's going to reassure her. He's going to do number 3 rather effortlessly. Does that make sense? And this is huge, if the guy, one of the best predictors of successful EFT is if you have a guy that can talk about emotions. I mean, it almost always goes well. If you have a guy that can drop down and say, well, when you come at me with that look in your eye, I feel worthless and like I have nothing that you want and that you're going to leave me eventually, and so I just hide. That is always a newsflash to the partner, and always provokes compassion, because nobody wants to make their partner feel that way. Do you know why? Think from an evolutionary perspective. a survival perspective. What happens if you make your partner feel worthless and like you're not there for them, if they're not performing? They leave. They leave. Remember, this is about keeping and maintaining human relationships to soothe and regulate your nervous system. If you have somebody walking out the door from you, you panic. And that's kind of it. And how you work with that is the art and the science of psychotherapy from an attachment perspective. It involves reflecting sequence and intensity, and more than anything else, it involves number one, staying curious and attuned to affect. So, as one of my mentors and teachers said, when in doubt, follow the affect. Let the affect guide you, like a dog on a scent. And with that, I've got maybe 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Yeah?
Well, I was just gonna ask, correct me if I misheard you, but usually this high-low pattern follows that where the woman is usually
The pursuer.
pursuer and the man is the one who shuts down.
Withdrawer, yeah.
Withdrawer.
Mm-hmm.
When would that, like, does that ever look different? And if it does, like, I don't know, does that just speak to, you know, how the woman was raised or how the man was raised in an attachment relationship?
That's a really great question. I wish I knew like the cultural research, because EFT is being studied all over the globe. So I don't know what the norms are, but in Western society, that is something like 90% of the time what the woman is the pursuer in heterosexual relationships. In my experience, that tends to be true, but when you have trauma in one or both people, when you have significant attachment disruptions in childhood or trauma, it gets goofy. You get people coming and going. Like, you know, one minute he's the pursuer, the next minute she is, and it gets kind of messy.
Well, I find that interesting because does that just mean, you know, 95% of the time the women in that situation had that anxious, insecure attachment?
No.
Or is
No,
that
no,
just
no.
how it's coming out in the argument?
No, again, culturally, what, all of you, women and men, if I say, where do men derive their sense of value and worth, generally, what would you say? Work. Respect, a sense of being respected, yes? Achievement,
Leader of the household.
being a leader, being strong. Where do women generally derive a sense of their value and worth? Caregiving? That's it? Relationships? Yeah. So think about which one of those groups is likely to be more in touch with affect. If you're valued because you perform and you work, what generally would you need to be good at doing with your nervous system? You'd have to be good at inhibiting negative affect. You'd have to be good at dissociating, splitting off. And historically, you'd have to be good at sacrificing yourself for the good of the herd or the community. Talk about inhibiting negative affect. You have to literally not have fear of dying. Not so, historically, with women.
That's really interesting.
Who are charged with what as their central task for the species? Keeping it going. Caregiving, relationship, being there and attentive and responsive, provisional in an emotional, relational way. Look, I'm not into gender stereotypes. I'm thinking from an evolutionary, over thousands of years of our species. This comes into your office, and you can watch it. Yeah.
Do you find sometimes that, if I can use the word, not
not a Christian attachment is very different from a Christian point of view, for its intentions even. The other one feels more like selfish, self-gratification. Well,
I gotta tell you honestly,
yeah.
in, I don't know, whatever, 17 years of clinical practice, I've never seen a difference with Christian couples. At all. I won't say they're worse, but they're definitely not better. And I don't know what that's about. I don't know what to tell you about.
Yeah, but it's more the intention of the therapist, or how do you see attachment? Do I see attachment more as it's good for you to self-soothe and to survive?
Oh, are you talking about a therapist who has a Christian perspective?
Yeah, for us to understand what is attachment.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood the question. I would say a Christian couple could have a leg up on doing this work of healing their attachment. If they do feel very secure in their relationship with God, I think that is a real advantage. If you're talking about, however, I don't see it play out that way clinically. Most Christian couples who come in are in the same amount of distress and trouble as their secular counterparts. It's hard to make many distinctions. In fact, Christian language can be complicated because it moralizes things. But the question is more about the faith of the provider or the therapist?
Yeah, because that would change the view of attachment, no? Is it more of a self-soothing, selfish need for me to survive, or is it more what we're created to be? It's just a very different view of attachment.
God. I don't know. Because I have to say, I think attachment theory is easily combines with Christianity and sort of our understanding of our spiritual identity. But that's my opinion of Christianity, and there are so many kinds of Christianity, so many kinds of people practicing as Christian therapists. I don't know. I'd like to think it makes a difference. I'll tell you what does make a difference. How attuned and present and responsive can you be as a therapist? So, from a Christian perspective, the way I would think about this, again, attachment is non-verbal. Right? Okay. So, how do you show God's love in a non-verbal way? How do you give them experiences of Christ in a non-verbal way? You don't give them Bible verses. You don't give them reading assignments. You incarnate something. You embody something. You embody presence. You're willing to feel pain. You're willing to sit in things that are uncomfortable and stay with them. I think there's a lot that's Christian about that. Yeah.
So if you're working with a couple or an individual who is perhaps manipulative and they can tell you what you need to hear in the session and then they go home, what do you do?
Slippery people. Yeah, there are a lot of slippery people. So that's tough. But if you're doing, so are you talking individually? If you're seeing them? Well, if you're seeing them as a couple, their spouse won't let them get away with it very often. You'll hear something like, "This is what they always do." To which you'd be like, "Oh, I'm curious about that. So what does this look like?" Well, I say this, then they do this, and then they say the right thing, and everybody thinks they're great, but really, when we get home, I'm going to be punished for this. Hear that one. And then you dig in. You try to dig into the emotions. You try to do what we do. And sometimes if you have really slippery people that have incredibly well-developed defenses, it's very difficult to make EFT work. There are other contraindications for doing EFT with couples. One is you have somebody who doesn't want to be there or doesn't want to save the marriage. If you have an active addiction, why would an active addiction make attachment work impossible? Look up there. Why would an active addiction make attachment work impossible? Go ahead, over here.
There you go.
Look at the compulsive caretaking over there.
It's a false way of getting back to calm. Or
It is
maybe
not a false way.
But it's, artificial?
It is a highly effective way
Yeah,
that is not human relationships,
there it is, yeah.
because human relationships were not predictable, not so responsive, not really safe to depend on. But what works every single time at regulating my nervous system? Alcohol, porn, gambling, weed, whatever. Get it? Okay. There's an attachment view of addictions. Addictions can easily be categorized as an attachment disorder. Active affairs. EFT will not work if there's an active affair. Same reason. Are you going to go to your partner to be soothed? Nope. I'm going somewhere else for that. Okay, I got nothing to work with here. Because EFT is based on working with the attachment system. So if you have competing, what we call competing attachments, it's going to make it very difficult. And by the way, would the partner ever trust enough to drop their guard and get vulnerable and reach out with somebody who is already getting their needs met somewhere else? That would be very foolish, and you'd be inviting them to a world of pain if you tried to do EFT with them. Yeah?
So what if infidelity happened in the past, doesn't happen anymore?
And by the way, most couples come in with something like that.
Yeah. And so then you're just working with that partner to kind of regain that trust and.
Yep. Yeah, so affairs, I mean, there are chapters in every EFT book on affairs and how to work with affairs. They are thought of as, significant attachment ruptures, but they're also thought of as symptoms. That the affair is not the cause of the problem, but is a result of a faulty attachment pattern in the couple, in the marriage. And that if it's put back in that context, the primary issue is working back to what's not working. But the process of getting through the affair itself and healing the recovery is its own little section of the EFT. We don't have time to do that section today, unfortunately. Yeah, time for maybe 1, 2 more questions, yeah.
You said for number 3,
Yeah.
step 3, that it comes naturally to most. If you were working with a couple and say one of the partners was unable to do that, not for a lack of willing, but just like not knowing how to, like how would you go about it?
It's a good question. It happens a lot. You wouldn't, in EFT you work through stages. And you wouldn't, one of the final stages is when you get them to do this to each other. And you don't have them do that until you're sure that it's gonna work. And if you're not sure it's gonna work, you don't take too many risks. So I would have been working for a long time to make sure the guy in this case did have connection and affective awareness, that he was re-engaging in the marriage and in the presence and in the desire to be there. If that's there, it's pretty safe. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, so the assumption is that though that a timely attuned response comes when you like understand what your partner is symbolizing.
Yeah, so let me put it in attachment scientific terms. If you have 2 nervous systems that are basically calming down, okay, and they started to trust that it's the cycle and the dance and this fight thing that's really killing them, and it's not each other. At EFT, the first stage of EFT is like recognizing the cycle. And you spend a lot of time saying, so when you do this, and you do this, and you feel that, and then you do this, until they're sick of it and they know it backwards and forwards. But what you're doing is very sneaky. You're externalizing the problem onto the dance, and you're freeing them up to come back together as partners against this pattern. When they're de-escalated, which means their nervous systems are calmer, and one reaches for the other, you're okay. Does that make sense? If one's reaching for the other and their nervous systems are on fire, it doesn't work very well. So EFT initially is a process of de-escalating the nervous system and the couple. Then you get to how to do reaches with them. And you could do all of this individually with people, but it just takes longer. And it's a little more complicated because you don't have the love lab right there. Okay? How you guys doing? Feelings in your body. What are you aware of? No? Yeah, it's late. Well, look, it is really, it helps me to go through all this stuff. It helps me to put it into words and tell you guys about what I do and how I think about it. So I appreciate the chance. You guys are really good. I know it's kind of sleepy, and it's a sleepy time of the semester and the year. But thanks for your engagement. And best of luck. Hopefully I'll see you guys again. Thanks.